Sally Struthers has at last spoken up about the stunning events that followed the death of a prominent figure, capturing public attention and touching the hearts of many devoted followers. Her remarks about someone as influential as Rob Reiner have left a great number of people genuinely surprised. New and thought-provoking details have emerged that append what many believe to be true, pointing to a far more intricate relationship than was ever publicly apparent. As her statements and their surrounding circumstances come under closer examination, the story that unfolds is one that defies simple expectations. When word spread of Rob Reiner's passing, the entertainment world braced for an outpouring of tributes from those closest to him. What nobody anticipated, however, was the conspicuous quiet coming from Sally Struthers, a woman celebrated for her openness and directness. For several weeks she said nothing, and that silence itself became the subject of widespread curiosity and speculation. When she finally chose to speak, her words carried none of the predictability that usually marks such occasions. Instead, they opened a window onto a version of events that had long remained hidden from public view. Her first public remarks struck a tone of both sorrow and careful introspection, suggesting that her bond with Reiner was considerably more layered than most people had ever realized. She was forthcoming about his stature as a filmmaker and as a cultural force, yet at the same time her words carried unmistakable traces of unfinished emotional business. The tension between her evident respect for him and the hint of something unresolved gave her statement a quality that instantly fascinated those who read or heard it, and people began wondering what history had been quietly folded away beneath the surface of their public interactions. The question of timing added yet another dimension to the unfolding story. Months had elapsed since Reiner's death before Struthers said a word, and observers drew varying conclusions from that gap. Some believed she had simply needed time away from the noise in order to gather her thoughts and process her grief in private. Others read her eventual statement as a deliberate contribution to a larger ongoing conversation about how famous people are remembered and how their legacies take shape. Whatever the true reason, the response was swift and substantial. People who had long admired Reiner found themselves looking at him through an entirely new set of eyes. What made her initial comments so striking was precisely their restraint. She did not seek to dramatize or sensationalize. She simply spoke with a measured honesty that hinted at deeper waters without splashing recklessly into them. In the world of celebrity commentary, where statements after a death tend to follow a well-worn script, this kind of thoughtful candor had the power to fundamentally shift how people understood a story they thought they already knew. Struthers gave full credit to Reiner's achievements in film and in public life, and this generosity of spirit lent her words a credibility they might otherwise have lacked. But alongside that acknowledgement came a quiet admission that their relationship had not been without its difficulties. Difficulties she declined to name outright, leaving listeners to fill in the blanks with their own imagination. That combination of honesty and discretion resonated widely, striking a chord with anyone who has ever struggled to put grief into language when the relationship behind it was complicated. The press moved quickly to pick up the story, centering their coverage on the fact that Struthers had finally broken her silence and framing her words as a potential turning point in how Reiner's story would be told. Across social media, fans wrestled visibly with the gap between the filmmaker they had long celebrated and the more complex individual her remarks seemed to describe. The story spread well beyond the usual boundaries of entertainment news because it touched on something genuinely universal: the challenge of holding admiration and honest reckoning in the same hands at the same time. Her position as someone who occupied a curious middle ground, connected to Reiner yet not among his innermost circle, gave her perspective a distinctive and unusual authority. She was neither an outsider looking in nor a close confidant speaking from the center, and that in-between quality made people listen more carefully than they might have otherwise. Questions multiplied about what had gone unsaid for so long between them, and the emotional undertow of her statement suggested that those unspoken things carried real weight. In the days that followed, further clues began to surface through interviews with mutual acquaintances and through comments shared on social media. The picture that gradually assembled itself was one of a relationship defined by genuine admiration alongside real distance, by warmth alongside tension that had never fully been resolved. Far from the clean, uncomplicated eulogies that typically attend the death of a celebrated figure, this was a story that breathed with all the messiness of actual human connection. Her words had created a stage dense with feeling and expectation, inviting people to think not only about Reiner himself but about the broader and more difficult question of how any of us make sense of loss when the person we have lost was never entirely simple to us. Rob Reiner's imprint on American film and television stretches across generations and touches an extraordinary range of subjects and styles. He first captured the public's imagination as an actor, bringing to life the sharp-tongued and idealistic Michael Stivic on All in the Family throughout the 1970s, a role that helped define the era and demonstrated Reiner's instinct for grounding political commentary in recognizable human behavior. His decision to step behind the camera would prove to be a natural extension of those same instincts. As a director, he created films that have endured long past the moments of their release. Pictures like This Is Spinal Tap, When Harry Met Sally, and The Princess Bride are not merely fondly remembered. They have shaped the very vocabulary of the genres they belong to, influencing the work of filmmakers who came after him and continuing to speak to audiences who discover them anew in each successive decade. His particular gift lay in finding the emotional truth at the center of even the most comedic or fantastical material, which is far rarer a talent than it might appear. Beyond his creative output, Reiner committed himself to causes that mattered to him regardless of the professional risks that commitment sometimes carried. He lent his name and energy to campaigns around voting rights, environmental protection, and the fight against hate, causes that defined him as something more than a Hollywood craftsman. This combination of artistic achievement and civic engagement gave his public profile a substance that many of his peers could not match. His career was not unmarked by controversy. Critics took issue with certain of his choices and with the directness of his political stances, and not everyone was willing to set those disagreements aside in favor of the broader record. Yet for most of his audience, the complaints were outweighed by the body of work itself. A body of work built on emotional honesty and a genuine understanding of what it means to be human. That understanding is what allowed him to reach people across very different backgrounds and to remain relevant across decades that saw the entertainment landscape transform around him. His family was woven throughout his professional life in ways both visible and quiet. His daughter Tracy pursued acting while his son Nick found his way into production, and the presence of family in his creative world added a personal warmth to his identity as a public figure. He was understood not only as a maker of films but as a man whose private life and professional commitments were genuinely interconnected. He also demonstrated a remarkable ability to adapt. As television, film, and digital media each in turn transformed the industry he worked in, Reiner found new ways to remain present and relevant, moving between documentary work, commercial projects, and traditional narrative filmmaking without losing the qualities that made him distinctively himself. He was not someone who clung stubbornly to one form. He followed the story wherever it needed to go. Public feeling about Reiner has always been layered. The admiration for his films and his activism is real and broadly shared, but so too is a recognition that he was a complicated individual whose relationships and decisions did not always read as simply as his public persona might suggest. It is precisely this complexity that makes the question of his legacy so genuinely interesting, and that complexity is what Struthers' comments brought back into sharp relief. The tributes that followed his death acknowledged both the breadth of his artistic achievement and the seriousness of his social commitments. He was recognized in multiple arenas as someone who had made a real difference. And yet events like Struthers' public statements serve as a reminder that legacies are never finished things. They grow and shift as new voices enter the conversation, and Reiner's will be no exception. The professional paths of Sally Struthers and Rob Reiner first intersected during the 1970s and 1980s, a period when both were actively building careers in an industry that operated as a remarkably tight-knit community. Though they came from different corners of that world, Struthers as a celebrated actress associated with Norman Lear's socially charged television, Reiner as an actor-turned-director making his mark across both the small and large screens, they moved within overlapping circles and encountered each other with a frequency that over time created something more than mere professional familiarity. Their collaboration, when it occurred, tended to happen less in front of cameras than behind them, in the shared spaces of advocacy and social cause work. Both were drawn to projects and campaigns that addressed questions of justice, children's welfare, and civil rights, and it was in those arenas that their connection deepened in ways that the general public had little reason to know about. Bonds formed around shared conviction can be among the most durable, but they can also generate their own particular tensions when the convictions in question belong to two strong-willed and distinctive personalities. Those who knew both parties have spoken of a relationship that was never simply warm or simply cold but genuinely mixed, shot through with mutual respect and real admiration alongside moments of friction and unease. The complexities that Struthers alluded to in her statement did not come as a surprise to people who had watched them navigate their connection over the years. What those observers understood was that the silence following Reiner's death was itself a kind of communication, that Struthers needed space before she could speak with the honesty and care that the situation demanded. Her eventual statement reflected both the depth of her regard for what Reiner had accomplished and her honest acknowledgement that their relationship had not always been easy. It was the kind of tribute that only someone with genuine history could offer, one that refused to flatten a complicated person into a simple symbol of either virtue or failing. The activism that connected them also sustained them through periods when other things might otherwise have driven them apart. In working side by side toward goals larger than either of their individual careers, they maintained a tie that ran deeper than the ordinary professional acquaintance. Yet that shared commitment did not dissolve the real differences between them. Differences in temperament, in approach, and in how each understood the relationship between art and advocacy. People who observed them together described two individuals who recognized something genuine in each other, while never quite managing to be entirely at ease in each other's company. That tension, between recognition and discomfort, between admiration and rivalry, is something familiar to anyone who has worked closely with a peer whose gifts and convictions mirror and sometimes compete with their own. Hollywood in its most productive decades generated many such relationships, and Struthers and Reiner's was entirely characteristic of an industry that brings exceptional people into close and sometimes combustible proximity. Understanding this history is essential to understanding why her decision to speak up after his death has struck such a resonant chord with so many people. The moment Struthers chose to speak, the reaction across social media was immediate and intense. People who had spent years or decades admiring Reiner's films found themselves suddenly presented with a portrait that was far less tidy than the one they had always carried. Many were genuinely taken aback to learn that unresolved tensions lay beneath the surface of what they had assumed was simply a history of professional respect. Conversations that had been focused on honoring a beloved filmmaker shifted rapidly toward something more searching and less certain. Some fans responded with empathy, understanding instinctively that speaking honestly about a person who has just died, especially when that relationship was complicated, requires real courage. But others pushed back, questioning whether the timing of her comments was appropriate, and whether giving voice to complexity so soon after his passing was fair to the memory he had left behind. The divergence of these reactions was itself revealing. It showed how deeply personal our investments in public figures can become, and how strongly we resist information that complicates those investments. Hashtags sprang up and spread rapidly across platforms, drawing in people who had never previously paid close attention to either Struthers or Reiner's off-screen lives. Longtime admirers of his films mingled in comment sections with newcomers who had encountered his work for the first time, and the conversation that resulted was charged with the kind of urgency that only emerges when something genuinely feels at stake. The story had moved well beyond the territory of ordinary celebrity gossip. It had become a debate about reputation, about loyalty, and about what we owe both the living and the dead when we speak about them in public. One portion of the audience doubled down in defense of Reiner's reputation, emphasizing the scale of his achievement and the sincerity of his advocacy while treating Struthers' remarks as a distraction from what truly mattered. For these viewers, the desire to protect a legacy they valued was stronger than the impulse toward a more complicated understanding. Another segment of the audience saw things very differently, applauding Struthers for the honesty it took to say out loud what others might have left safely unspoken, and arguing that even the most celebrated figures are finally just human beings, shaped by the same fears and limitations as everyone else. People also found in this story a mirror for their own experiences. The difficulty of navigating grief when the person lost was not uncomplicated, the question of how much honesty is owed to the dead and how much to those left behind. This personal dimension drew many into the conversation who might otherwise have remained on the sidelines, and it gave the story a resonance that extended far beyond the usual boundaries of entertainment news. Polling conducted around this time indicated a modest decline in the overwhelmingly positive assessments of Reiner held by some segments of the public, particularly among younger audiences less familiar with his earlier work. This shift underscored a truth that this episode made unavoidably clear: that how a person is remembered depends enormously on who is doing the remembering and when they choose to speak. Within the professional community that knew both Struthers and Reiner, her decision to speak openly generated responses that ranged from admiration to careful reflection. Many in the industry recognized immediately how unusual it was for someone in her position to offer anything other than a carefully managed tribute, and they understood that the courage required to depart from that expectation should not be underestimated. Her willingness to bring genuine feeling and honest complication to a moment usually dominated by polished sentiment was seen by many as both brave and long overdue. Directors and producers who had worked with Reiner described him as someone who possessed a rare and genuine creative vision, while also acknowledging that careers of the kind he built are not constructed without conflict and difficulty. His professional relationships, like those of most people who operate at the highest levels of a competitive and high-stakes industry, were marked by both genuine bonds and real tensions. Struthers had simply named what many in that world already understood to be true. Fellow actors who had shared sets or projects with both of them spoke with empathy about the particular difficulty of maintaining honest relationships under the pressure of public life. The entertainment world asks its participants to perform one version of themselves in public while navigating something far more complicated in private, and the gap between those two versions can become, over time, very large indeed. Struthers' decision to speak from the private side of that gap was recognized by many of her peers as an act of genuine integrity. Those who work in public relations and media strategy noted that her approach represented a meaningful break from established norms. The conventional wisdom in celebrity circles holds that statements following a peer's death should be brief, warm, and scrupulously non-controversial, and that departing from this formula carries real professional risk. That Struthers departed from it anyway, and accepted whatever consequences might follow, suggested to observers that she was driven by something more pressing than image management, a genuine need to tell the truth as she understood it. The broader industry watched with interest to see how her words might shape the ongoing conversation about Reiner's place in Hollywood history. At a moment when questions of transparency and accountability have become increasingly central to how the entertainment world understands itself, her statement arrived with unusual timeliness, adding a voice and a perspective that the official narrative had not previously included. News organizations responded to Struthers' statement quickly, and with considerable variety in how they chose to frame it. Some outlets leaned into the element of surprise, presenting her remarks as revelations that could materially alter the way Reiner was publicly understood. Others took a more measured approach, situating her words within the longer arc of both their careers and offering readers the context needed to weigh what she had said thoughtfully rather than reactively. The full spectrum from sober analysis to outright sensationalism was on display, as it tends to be whenever a story combines celebrity, death, and unexpected candor. Established publications with longer institutional memories brought a steadying perspective to the coverage, reminding audiences of the full complexity of both figures' histories and resisting the temptation to reduce Struthers' statement to a simple headline. These outlets helped create space for a more nuanced conversation, one that could hold both respect for Reiner's achievements and honest engagement with the complications his life and relationships involved. Social media, as is its nature, moved faster and with less caution. Influencers and commentators seized on selected passages, sometimes without the full context needed to interpret them accurately, and the result was a rapid and sometimes distorting amplification of certain aspects of the story at the expense of others. The speed at which information spreads in this environment can be both democratizing and destabilizing, and this story illustrated both qualities clearly. The coverage also reflected a shift that has been gathering momentum in entertainment journalism for some years, a growing appetite for stories that acknowledge the full texture of public figures' lives rather than presenting only the carefully curated version. Struthers' remarks fit naturally into this evolving landscape, and her willingness to speak plainly was recognized by many commentators as both personally courageous and culturally timely. Not everyone welcomed the coverage. Some critics pointed to moments where the pursuit of the story tipped over into something that felt less like honest journalism and more like exploitation, where the urgency to publish overwhelmed the responsibility to handle genuinely private feelings with appropriate care. This tension between the public's legitimate interest in the truth about its cultural figures and the obligation to treat those figures with basic dignity is one that entertainment journalism has never fully resolved. Thoughtful essays emerged in some corners of the media landscape, wrestling seriously with the ethical questions raised by posthumous revelations of this kind. How much weight should be given to disclosures made after someone can no longer respond? How do we balance the claims of historical truth against the claims of grief and respect? These questions have no easy answers, but the fact that they were being asked seriously at all was itself a sign that the story had opened up something worth thinking carefully about. The question of why Struthers chose to speak when she did has generated considerable analysis and speculation. For some observers, the explanation is straightforwardly psychological. Grief is not a linear or predictable process, and months may pass before someone is ready to articulate publicly what they have been working through privately. The delay was not necessarily strategic. It may simply have been necessary. Others have suggested that she was waiting for a cultural moment in which her particular perspective could be received with the seriousness it deserved. A moment when the conversation around celebrity, legacy, and the complexity of public life was open enough to accommodate something more honest than the usual tribute. There is reason to think she understood that speaking too soon would risk having her words drowned out or misread, and that waiting allowed her to contribute to a dialogue rather than merely interrupting one. A third possibility is that she wanted to assert her own place in a story that had largely been told without her. When a prominent figure dies, the narrative of their life tends to crystallize quickly around the voices that are most immediately present, and those who were part of that life in more complicated ways can easily find themselves crowded out. Speaking after the initial wave of tributes had subsided may have been a way of ensuring that her version of events received fair attention. Those who know her well describe someone who does not act impulsively, someone who thinks carefully before speaking and who understands the weight of words. This characterization supports the view that her statement, whenever it came, was the product of genuine deliberation rather than emotion poorly controlled. She chose her moment, and she chose it for reasons that were hers alone to fully understand. Some have also proposed that a sense of moral responsibility played a role, a feeling that certain truths about Reiner's life and about their relationship were in danger of being permanently erased by a narrative that was, in her view, incomplete. This would align with values she has demonstrated throughout her public life. A commitment to honesty even when honesty is difficult, and a belief that the full truth about a person ultimately serves their memory better than a sanitized version. Finally, it is possible that the growing public curiosity about her silence itself created pressure she eventually felt unable to ignore. When the fact of not speaking becomes itself a subject of speculation and commentary, continuing to say nothing can start to feel like its own kind of statement, one she may not have wanted to make. What Struthers has set in motion with her remarks is unlikely to be quickly resolved or neatly concluded. She has reminded a wide audience that even the most beloved and celebrated figures are finally human beings, shaped by histories that do not reduce easily to the terms of public admiration. Her honesty has complicated the story of Rob Reiner in ways that feel, ultimately, more respectful of who he actually was than any idealized portrait could manage to be. For those who study and care about cultural history, her contribution matters because it insists on complexity. The temptation to smooth over the difficult parts of a revered figure's story is always strong, and it takes a kind of courage to resist that temptation, to say clearly that admiration and honest reckoning are not opposites but necessary companions. Struthers has modeled what that courage looks like, and others in similar positions may find it easier to follow her example. Her willingness to speak may also open up space for a different kind of conversation about how we handle grief and memory in public life. A conversation less focused on the performance of proper feeling and more willing to acknowledge that the emotions surrounding loss, especially when the person lost was complicated, are rarely simple or clean. Reiner's films will continue to matter. The body of work he left behind is genuinely remarkable, and nothing that has emerged in the wake of his death diminishes the achievement it represents. If anything, understanding the full human being behind that work, with all his contradictions and difficulties, makes the achievement more interesting, not less. Art made by complicated people is still art, and sometimes it is richer for the complications that went into making it. The entertainment world is in the midst of a genuine reckoning with its own habits of storytelling, with its tendency to create and maintain myths about its most prominent figures rather than engaging honestly with who those figures actually were. Struthers' statement is a small but real contribution to the better version of that storytelling, the version that trusts audiences to handle complexity without losing their capacity for admiration. For Struthers herself, speaking up has added dimension to how the public understands her. She is no longer simply a recognizable face from a celebrated era of television. She is someone who demonstrated, at a moment of genuine difficulty, that honesty matters more to her than comfort. That is not a small thing. The conversation she has opened will continue to evolve, shaped by new voices and new perspectives as they emerge. The challenge for everyone participating in it is to hold the full picture in mind at once, to honor what Reiner built and contributed while making room for the honest reckoning that a complete understanding of any life requires. That is the kind of remembering that actually serves the people being remembered, and it is the kind that endures.